Okay, we've covered it in passing in other parts of the course, but I want to dig into how we understand what a construct does. And really this is relevant for these constructs here, the level 2 constructs like our rule and like our Node.js function. As you might have seen from a previous lesson, if I command and click, which is the editor shortcut I use to find the source file for this class, I get put into the TypeScript type definitions, and then if I find that area in the CDK code here, all I've got is the type definitions and the minified file, minified JavaScript. Now we could format that if you like and then have a read through it, but what I think is easier is to take the name of the construct you're interested in, search for AWS CDK, then the name, find that construct here, and then just going to double check this is version 2 of the documentation, which it is, and then we can see sometimes some examples and sometimes some other bits and pieces of useful information. We're not going to look at this main documentation page, but what we're actually going to read is the TypeScript source code. So I'm going to click the little source button here. That takes us to the file with the construct in, with the source code. And so what I would do next is find the constructor, and luckily the constructor is just underneath the definition of the class here. And we can go and have a look at what the components are. So there's a bit of validation in here. We've got some defaults, and that might be really useful to you if you prefer to only provide arguments when they are different to the default. And then we are calling this super method here. So we've got to go and have a look at what Lambda function is. And there are two visible, one for CloudFront functions and one for Lambda functions. So let's navigate to the Lambda one. So this extends function base. And so let's have a look at the constructor. Let's see if it's using that. So it's quite a big class, this one. And you might find it easier to check out the whole CDK code base if you like, rather than browsing in the web UI. It's up to you. So here's a constructor, and we're calling super in function base. And now I know with function base there's actually no constructor in there. We're going straight through to the class above that in the hierarchy, which is just a regular old resource. But that's only setting the physical name of the resource to the actual function name. So there's plenty of validation in here, which is really handy because it stops you from trying to create the resource in AWS with an invalid value. So that's nice. And there's more bits and pieces here about validating the length of description. And then we start some of the logic where we have an abstraction. So in this case, we start off with a list or an array of managed policies, which, as the name would suggest, are policies that exist in their own right in AWS. They're not like an inline policy, they're a separate one. And then we start adding ones that are going to be really useful to our Lambda function. So if we are just making a regular Lambda, we'll get the basic execution role, which has some CloudWatch permissions. If we have a VPC specified, we will get the VPC access role for creating network interfaces. If we specified a role, then it will use that. Otherwise, it will create one with the service principal that we'd expect. If you know from the previous lessons, we've tried them with some other values, see what would happen. And then we go through here, configuring various aspects of the function, doing whatever we need to create one or more CloudFormation resources. And in the case of a Lambda function, it's always going to be many CloudFormation resources because there's lots of components going into it. And when you're using these constructs, for anything other than the most basic cases, it does help to have a little bit of a read through the constructor and through the source code of the construct in general, especially if something's happening and you're not expecting it to behave in that way. So if you're getting a parameter in there, maybe say an environment variable or something, and you're wondering why is that in there? Why is that happening? It makes sense to have a read of the source code and see what's going on. And the problem is that there's quite a lot going on with a lot of these constructs because they are such a polished experience layer. You can do a hell of a lot with them, and they try to save you from a lot of boilerplate, a lot of manual work, and that means that they get pretty weighty. So it takes all the way down from where the constructor started up here, all the way down to line 799 here, until we actually make or explicitly make the first CloudFormation resource. And we have to pass in a huge number of properties here because we're catering for almost any available circumstance, if you like, or any possible outcome. And then once that's been created, we then have to link some dependencies together. It's a really nice example of when an explicit dependency is required for that. And we might do other bits and pieces. We might create some more resources that are required for what we're trying to do. So perhaps we will create this log retention construct, which creates or updates a CloudWatch log group. That's why it's named like that instead of, say, CloudWatch log group. And then we carry on with the rest of them to do with more advanced features like setting up a file system, an EFS file system. And then you'll see towards the end of this constructor, we're then looking at some other methods that will be going to be private methods most likely that do more things with our Lambda. Now, if you remember from our example of creating a very simple application, the brush your teeth application, we had a much smaller constructor than the one that's specified here. And obviously this Lambda function, or this Lambda construct, I should say, is quite advanced. It does a ton of things. But I would try and have a think about, do you really want a constructor that is as big as the one that they provided here? Even with my regular screen resolution, not the one I use for recording, and a decent sized screen, that's not going to fit in one screen. There's a ton going on. And so it's quite difficult sometimes to trace things through and find out what's going on. So it's just something there for you to bear in mind. And then we can go pop in one of these private methods and just see what that does. So it's got a little bit of validation again. And then it checks it adds a Lambda layer, and then that's another private method. Oh, sorry, that's actually a public method because it's something that we might call as well. And that's changing the configuration that's then going to get used to make the CloudFormation props. And if we go back, then we see that we're doing this.role.add to manage policy. And again, that's creating a list or collection of things in the code that's then going to get turned into some resources later on. So we have to try and translate that into the actual CloudFormation resources, which then informs what we get in AWS. So I don't want to scare you too much if you're thinking, oh my word, there's a lot of stuff in this file. It gets a lot easier to read through these constructs, and often you don't have to understand the whole thing to use it really effectively. It's only normally when something goes wrong. But sometimes having looked through the code base can inform you about what the usage is supposed to be, how you're supposed to use a function. And sometimes when you're trying to link resources together, it can help to see what options and methods you've got and how that's translating into things you get in the template. Aside from reading the code, the other thing that we can do is always running a CDK synth, which is our synth package script. So because we've got a deployment of this that's relatively new, obviously we have the files already in our cdk.out, but you might not want to run a deployment or something that would update these. You might just want to see what's going on as you change some properties. You might want to change a construct, see what happens, change another parameter, see what happens, add another parameter, see what happens, and watch that happen over time. And so to do that, we would do our npm run synth, and then we can redirect it into a file like template.yaml. So that, I think, is another easy way to see what construct is doing, especially if you're from more of an infrastructure background than a coding background, where you might not want to have to read through all that TypeScript code. You might just want to see the nitty-gritty of the resources. And so that alternative might work better for you as you're iterating on your CDK projects. So to recap, I would recommend taking the construct name and searching for it in the GitHub project. I think it's easier to go and navigate through that way. You can, of course, check the whole project out locally and use it that way if you prefer, but it's quite a big project and you have to keep it up to date quite frequently. Or alternatively, you can just run some synths and see what comes out.